Vice are homebrew console mods that let you bypass manufacturer restrictions illegal in any sense. Most of us think of copyright infringement in the sense of, copying somebody else's creation, right? If I take somebody else's video, upload it as my own, copyright infringement. Take somebody's picture, upload it as my own, copyright infringement. If I take somebody's game, make a copy of it, copyright infringement. But what happens when you try to essentially bypass security measures or restrictions built into them by the manufacturer? And for that, right away in the beginning days of the console, when we start developing this proprietary console, not in the early in the sense of not the Atari and Magnavox days, but the later on, let's say second generation of your Nintendo and your Sega, and later on with the early Sony's. The question is, what happens if I want to bypass it? And we have cases on that because we've had a number of cases where developers like Accolade try to develop games, let's say for, I believe, Sony, without paying a licensing fee. Uh, was it Sony or was it Sega? Can't remember right now. But they didn't want to pay the licensing fee. I believe at that point the case read that you would have to pay, and I'd like to think it's Sega, because I believe it was cartridges, and Sony we didn't have cartridges. But I believe they had to pay $10 to $15 per cartridge, right? So that's a fee that would have to pay Sega, independent of what they would have to cover their own cost of manufacturing, as well as charge the ultimate consumer. That is a huge chunk of money. So they tried to find ways around that. Now, how do you start developing games for a console that you don't own without rights? Obviously, Sega basically built restrictions into it, and there were a number of different restrictions over time that they were using not only to catch who was doing what Accolade was trying to do, but also in trying to prevent largely piracy. They really were trying to prevent piracy more than what Accolade was doing. And it went through the legal system. We had a couple of different cases on this issue, and what we come down to is that while in copyright law, we do have a provision that does not permit you to actually bypass security measures, right? So if you are hacking into computer systems, that itself could be copyright infringement. If you are bypassing password, the username kind of security, that could be copyright infringement because the bypassing of security measures to get into software is copyright infringement as well. And in this case, we had bypassing of either security built into the chip or into a software. The early days was much more of a software-related kind of security, although we had some chip-based securities within the later cartridges, that would be copyright infringement. So there were lawsuits originally saying that, well, if you have, when you, in order to build your games, you actually had to buy one of our games. You then had to basically reverse engineer it in order to build your own game. In the process, you had to bypass our security measures. That would be copyright infringement. Now, what the courts have held, that in fact, that's not copyright infringement. In this particular case, bypassing security is, but in this case, the way it was done, basically it was for reverse engineering purposes, so they could build their own. At that point, that was not copyright infringement. So when you're speaking about a homebrew system, one of the things you have to think about, what does that mean? If you are trying to essentially bypass security measures, whether they're not built into the game software or built into the hardware, you have to consider it whether or not you're using as a reverse engineering purposes or just to break in. If it is to break into the system, that's still going to be copyright infringement. If it is to bypass it so you can temporarily copy it or copy it for purposes of reverse engineering it so that you can, let's say, build your own code, independently build code, that is likely to be found to be fair use. So homebrewed systems are okay. It depends how it's done, and we have to get into the nitty gritty of the things really is before we can answer that. So, but in effect, that's one of the principles you have to keep in mind, is that bypassing security is copyright infringement, as well as actually copying code. But when you do that for the purpose of reverse engineering, so that you can build an independently produced software or hardware, that's not copyright infringement. That is fair use.
When the lights are out and you stumble in the dark, you kept pushing on, but then you went too far. When your ship has sailed and all your dreams are lost, everything is wrong, you feel like it's your fault.